Hi everyone. In today's mini lecture, we will be looking at the early years of the French Empire in Africa, whilst bringing in much of the context of France's situation in the years following the Napoleonic era. France's conquest of Algiers, in today's Algeria, would herald French control in the region that would last up until the 1960s. It is strange to think about, given that we know France ended up as a republic in the end. But following Napoleon's first defeat in 1814, the clocks in France were reset, and the Bourbon dynasty were briefly returned to the throne. At first, the Bourbon restoration was moderately popular, as the new king, Louis XVIII, promised to rule by a constitution known as the Chart, which would limit his powers. Moreover, he promised peace in Europe and an end to Napoleon's wars of conquest, which had lost many French men their lives and lost many French women their loved ones. Following Napoleon's brief return in the Hundred Days of 1815 and his final defeat at Waterloo, a more hardline royalist policy was pursued, in which Napoleonic officials were killed or driven from the country. This left the Bourbons with a more hostile population to manage than they had before Napoleon returned in 1814. Still, conditions in Louis XVIII's France were generally good, with strong economic boom and popular military intervention in Spain. Upon Louis's death, he was succeeded by his younger brother, Charles X, who was a far more reactionary figure. As anger towards Charles's reactionary politics grew, voices also began to grumble that France had lost the pride it had once held under Napoleon, where for a time all of Europe seemed subject to the whims of Paris. King Charles and his prominent Prime Minister, Jules de Polignac, sought to rally patriotic French support by creating a French colonial empire outside of Europe. An expedition was sent to Madagascar, but the most notable French invasion was in Algiers, a port city lying on the other side of the Mediterranean from the French Riviera. Algiers had long been an autonomous province, or beylik, in the Ottoman Empire. It had command over the northern coast of today's Algeria, but the Algerian interior, defined by its mountains and its deserts, simply ignored the Ottoman Bey in Algiers and refused to pay taxes towards him. The pretext for the French invasion stemmed from the riches that Algiers had accrued during the revolutionary period, as the city had supplied much of the food which allowed Napoleon's armies to operate. The French could not afford this food at the time and paid with credit. In 1827, the Ottoman Bey demanded that the French repay their debts. When the French consul or regional ambassador in Algiers refused this request, citing that the monarchy could not be held responsible for the debts of the revolutionary state, the Bey touched him with his fan. King Charles used this minor incident as a pretext to break off diplomatic relations and prepare for war. In July 1930, 38,000 French soldiers landed in Algeria and made their way to Algiers. The Bey sent a force of 10,000 men to fight against them, including 1,000 Janissaries, but these were defeated and the city quickly taken. The Bey and his Janissaries were then exiled, and the French now had command of Algiers. The French occupying force seized lands and properties from the locals and looted many treasures to take back with them to France. Massacres of civilians were widespread. From the start, France's presence in Algeria was both violent and exploitative. The king's gambit, however, had failed. The conquest in Africa was not as popular as he had expected, and the removal of France's best troops from Paris made it all too easy, at the end of the month, for Charles to be overthrown in the July Revolution. France was now very much a constitutional monarchy ruled by Louis Philippe of the House of Orléans. The new regime had attacked the Algerian invasion during the revolution as a foolish example of pointless foreign adventure. They thus faced a strange situation in Algeria, which they had never sought to conquer. The Orleanists' 18 years in power saw a type of standoff in which the French military largely ran Algiers and its surroundings, whilst local leaders ran other areas of the coast and, of course, the interior of Algeria. One powerful resistance figure to the French invasion was the Islamic scholar Abulkader el-Jazari, who protected the west of the country. Following the French conquest of the large coastal city of Oran in 1831, Abulkader was asked by the tribes to rally them around one banner of resistance. Abulkader's subsequent military successes forced the French to recognize his authority in the region, which he then ruled as emir. Abulkader's state was ruled along Islamic lines, but he also allowed Christians and Jews to live in his state and work in the civil service. Probably due to a miscommunication, French troops entered Abulkader's lands in 1839, and the emir counterattacked, pushing the French back to Algiers. France responded with an all-out attack on Algeria, launching over 100,000 men there under the command of General Thomas Robert Bougaud. The subsequent 8 years saw horrific acts of brutality notable even in the context of colonial France. Bougaud responded to Algerian guerrilla warfare by torching Algerian agricultural plots and even chased communities into caves where he would intentionally asphyxiate them with smoke from his fires. Abulkader was forced to surrender in 1847 and settled in Damascus, where he would later save the Christian community in the city from a massacre, earning him praise from around the world. He remains an Algerian national hero to this day. It was only during the short-lived French Second Republic, founded after the 1848 revolution and lasting for only 3 years, that French rule in Algeria was solidified, with the division of the country into provinces who took their orders from Paris. Settlers began to arrive in Algeria in ever-increasing numbers, taking the best agricultural land from the locals and demanding privileges and rights from the French government. Many of the new settlers were not French but Spaniards, Italians, and Maltese. Over the following century they would, like the British settlers in Ireland or the Creoles in South America, develop an identity separate from the French who lived in France. Their numbers would, however, never approach those of the pre-existing Muslim population of Algeria, and their rule would always be dependent on military backing. Just like the settlers of Saint Domingue, the French Algerians would forever be sleeping at the foot of Vesuvius. The French presence in Senegal had begun in the 1600s when French merchants established a port city, St. Louis, at the mouth of the Senegal River. From this island city, which also became a haven for African Christians, merchants traded with the local population, purchasing slaves and gold from them. The British, drawn to the island by its commanding position on the Senegal River, constantly captured St. Louis before giving it back to France in one treaty or another. Slaves continued to be captured, purchased, and transported to the Caribbean during the entire period of this inter-European rivalry. During one of the many periods of occupation, Great Britain abolished the slave trade, decimating the economy of St. Louis. When the island and the city returned to French control in 1816, the French were forbidden by the British from re-establishing the slave trade. French merchants sought to make up for their loss by switching to a plantation economy in the colony. After all, slavery was still legal, even if the slave trade had been banned. At first, the plantation owners tried to grow peanuts and then cotton, before settling on gum as their consumer good of choice. The plantation system established would set the precedent for the economic exploitation of Africa that, by the end of the 19th century, the British, the Portuguese, the Belgians, and the Germans would also come to practice. After 1816, the French gradually began to increase their influence in Senegal, buying off or bullying a series of small kingdoms which existed in the area. Eventually, in 1825, during the rule of the aforementioned King Charles X, French forces launched an all-out invasion of the Senegalese emirate of Trarza. Trarza had earned the anger of France by selling its gum directly to the British, circumventing the customs dues of St. Louis merchants and undercutting the French plantation economy. The French forces were victorious in the war and increased their exploitation of the lands to the north of the Senegal River. Just like with Algeria, the emergence of the French Second Republic after the 1848 revolution heralded widespread changes in Senegal. Firstly, slavery was now abolished entirely, and all current slaves became free. Secondly, the French cities in Senegal were now, like the cecilers in Algeria, allowed to send a parliamentary representative to Paris to represent their interests. The system was manipulated to ensure that few black residents could influence the vote, and, in any case, Emperor Napoleon III abolished this seat entirely following his coup in 1852. Nonetheless, the seat was more representative than African colonies in the British colonies ever received in Westminster, and helps to highlight the different ways in which Britain and France saw their colonial empires. The early French Empire in Africa is important, as it signifies trends that were to remain throughout the 19th century. Firstly, French forces were filling the vacuum left by the weakness of the Ottoman Empire and its client states. This is significant as the Christian Europeans would attempt to convert the African people much as Islam had once done, heralding an age of religious conflict in Africa that continues until today. Secondly, the incredible violence which heralded the French invasions left a legacy of bitterness and resentment that would be replicated in subsequent European invasions in the African continent. Thirdly, many French citizens settled in the new African lands, lording over the native black population and rebelling against Paris whenever it seemed the latter would offer concessions. Lastly, both Algeria and Senegal were heavily economically exploited for French profits. This economic exploitation accelerated after the banning of slavery and, significantly, continued on unaffected by whatever form of government ruled in Paris at the time. Republics, as well as monarchies, would go on to exploit Africa together for the next 100 years.